Hi guys, welcome to Bedtime Sleepy, where even the hardest journeys are told gently. They didn't starve because they were weak. They starved because they trusted a map. In the summer of 1846, more than 500 men, women and children set out from Independence, Missouri. Their wagons creaked under the weight of furniture, seed corn, iron cook stoves, and that particular brand of American hope that convinces ordinary people to attempt extraordinary, dangerous things. They were heading for California. They believed the trip would take 4 months. They believed the route they'd chosen was a shortcut, a faster, cleaner path to the life they'd been picturing since the first time someone handed them a guidebook. They believed the man who recommended it knew the land well. He didn't. He'd covered part of it once on horseback without wagons in a different season, and he'd written about it as though none of those differences mattered. They did. That gap between what he claimed and what was actually true would cost 41 people their lives. Children who hadn't yet learned to read, elderly women who'd survived 7 decades of everything the eastern seaboard could throw at a person, fathers who'd sold everything they owned for the chance at land and sunlight on the other side. Before you settle in tonight, stay with this story for just a little while. What happened to the people who tried to cross the Rocky Mountains in a covered wagon isn't simply a chapter about the pioneer era. It's a reckoning with the limits of human confidence, with the cruelty of mountain geography, and with the real cost of believing the world is more manageable than it is, especially when the people profiting from that belief have every reason to keep telling you it's true. If this kind of history finds you in the quiet of the evening, let it settle the way a good story should, and if you haven't yet, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell history slowly here, the way it was actually lived, not the way it's been polished for monuments and textbooks. The Rocky Mountains stretch more than 3,000 miles, from the dry scrubland of New Mexico all the way north to the rain-soaked forests of British Columbia. Their average elevation exceeds 10,000 feet above sea level. Their passes, those narrow cuts in the ridgeline that wagon trains had to thread like a needle through stone, were unpredictable, seasonally dangerous, and in the wrong month, completely impassable. A pass that was clear and open in August could be buried under 12 feet of snow by the first week of November, and yet, between 1840 and 1869, an estimated 400,000 Americans crossed those mountains, on foot, on horseback, or in wagons pulled by oxen that had already walked more than 1,000 miles just to reach the eastern base of the range. They came from Ohio, from Illinois, from Missouri and Kentucky and Indiana. They came from Germany, Ireland and Scandinavia. They came because someone told them the crossing was possible, the land was good, and that whatever the trip asked of them, it was worth it. They called it going west. Historians would eventually call it one of the most dangerous mass migrations in peacetime human history. The death toll along those overland routes is still debated among scholars, but the most careful estimates put the number somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 emigrants who died along the Oregon, California and Mormon trails during those 3 decades. Work through the arithmetic and the number stops being abstract. It becomes something you can see. 1 grave for every 85 to 90 yards of trail, not concentrated on a battlefield, not gathered in a single epidemic, scattered, one by one, family by family, across 2,000 miles of American continent, in river crossings that looked shallow and weren't, in cholera camps that appeared in the morning and buried people by evening, in the slow, quiet collapse of bodies pushed too far, fed too little, and rested almost never. 1 grave per football field of American landscape, across an entire continent, in a migration sold to ordinary families as the road to a better life. Think about that for a moment, because those numbers represent real households, real names on real wagon registers, Real children who'd been promised something on the other side of those mountains. Most of the people who died on the overland trails didn't go dramatically. They didn't go memorably. They died of cholera, contracted from contaminated water near the Missouri River before they'd even crossed into Kansas. They died of typhoid, dysentery, and measles. Children fell from moving wagon beds and were crushed under wooden wheels that weighed 400 pounds and didn't slow for anything. Men were kicked by oxen during the daily yoking and died of internal injuries with no surgeon within 3 days' ride. Women died in childbirth attended only by the other women in camp. Women who did what they could with what they had, which was almost never enough. And if a family survived all of that, survived the plains, the river crossings, the disease camps, the heat, and the weeks of identical grinding days, they reached the Rocky Mountains, and the mountains didn't care how far they'd come or how much they deserved to finish. There was a girl travelling in 1846 who understood that indifference earlier, and more clearly than most adults twice her age. Her name was Virginia Reed. She was 12 years old when her family left Springfield, Illinois in April of that year. The eldest child of a prosperous furniture dealer named James Fraser Reed, who had read a guidebook and decided California was where his family's future belonged. By the time winter found Virginia stranded in the Sierra Nevada with no food, no rescue in sight, and no certainty that any of them would see spring again, she had already lost her grandmother. She'd watched her family abandon nearly everything they'd hauled from Illinois. She'd seen her father ride off alone into the Nevada desert, banished from the wagon train for killing a man in an argument. She was 13 by then, barely. She kept the younger children warm. She helped her mother stretch the last of the food. She didn't panic, and she would remember every detail for the rest of her long life. Virginia's story runs through this entire documentary like a thread pulled tight. You'll come back to her, but her story only makes full sense against the larger world that put her on that mountain. The bad information, the commercial pressures, the overconfidence, and the specific American cultural moment that convinced 400,000 people that the right attitude could outpace any geography. What made the Rocky Mountain crossing so reliably deadly wasn't only the terrain, though the terrain was genuinely, specifically murderous for anyone moving through it with loaded wagons and exhausted animals. It was the collision between incomplete knowledge and absolute confidence. The way emigrant culture in the 1840s moved toward the West, with a certainty that determination could substitute for accurate information. That optimism could outrun altitude, distance, and the hard calendar of an approaching winter. Emigrants were working from guidebooks that were frequently wrong, maps that were sometimes drawn from guesswork, advice from promoters who had financial stakes in westward migration they never disclosed and were never asked to. The most damaging of these publications, Lansford Hastings' Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, published in 1845, described a shortcut through the Wasatch Mountains south of the Great Salt Lake that Hastings himself had never actually travelled by wagon. He'd moved through it on foot in a different season, without the drag of 2,000-pound wagons, dying cattle, or the pressure of winter closing in behind him. He wrote about it as though those details changed nothing. They changed everything. What's remarkable is that Hastings was promoting this route even as families were already on the trail, sending letters ahead, urging wagons he'd never met to trust a path he'd never properly tested. The Donna Reed Party chose that route in the summer of 1846 following his advice. They lost 3 critical weeks hacking through 36 miles of Wasatch Canyon that the guidebook suggested could be crossed in days. 3 weeks they couldn't recover. 3 weeks that put them at the foot of the Sierra Nevada in mid-October instead of mid-September. By then, the passes above Truckee Lake were already catching early snow. The group pushed on anyway, because turning back meant admitting something none of them were yet prepared to admit. That the map had lied, that the guide had guessed, that the shortcut had become the most expensive miles of their lives. By the end of this story, you'll understand something most Americans have never been told plainly or directly. The Overland Trail wasn't simply a triumph of pioneer spirit against an indifferent wilderness. It was a lesson, a hard, irreversible one, in what happens when confidence runs ahead of knowledge. When ordinary families, carrying incomplete and commercially shaped information and an enormous, entirely American quantity of hope, are pointed at a mountain range by people who profit from their movement and told to keep going no matter what they see. The Rockies were the final exam in a test most emigrants didn't know they were taking. The passing grade was survival. Many didn't pass. What was the world these people left behind? What did they actually understand? And what did they fundamentally get wrong about the world they were entering? The answer doesn't begin in the mountains. It begins in the ordinary texture of everyday life long before a single wagon wheel started turning westward. Close your eyes for a moment and place yourself on the Missouri frontier in the spring of 1846. The smell reaches you before anything else does. River mud and horse dung and the smoke of 100 breakfast fires burning at once across a mile of churned prairie. And underneath all of that, cutting right through it, the sharp green smell of grass so freshly broken by wagon wheels that it still holds the cool of the night in its fibers. You're standing at the edge of a trampled field outside Independence, Missouri, and the noise is unlike anything you've heard before. The low rhythmic groan of wagon wheels being greased with tallow from a tin bucket. The complaint of oxen being yoked for the first time after a week's rest. Children crying and then laughing within the same breath. Men arguing over roots in voices loud enough to carry over all of it. The air itself feels charged. That particular electricity of mass departure, of people leaving everything they know and stepping toward everything they don't. Independence. Missouri was the edge of the known world. West of here, there was no postal service, no sheriff's office, no doctor with a shingle in the window, no church where you could leave word for someone you were trying to reach. There were roughly 2,000 miles of continent between you and California. Most of it mapped at a scale that was useless for the decisions you'd actually have to make. Where to cross a river, how long a canyon took on foot versus by wagon, how many miles you could push exhausted animals before they started dying. At the far end of those 2,000 miles stood a mountain range that had already killed people who were better prepared than you. But standing here in April, with the cottonwoods budding along the Missouri River and the whole country seeming to lean westward like grass in a strong wind, none of that felt close. What felt real was the wagon. Your wagon. Loaded with everything you'd decided you couldn't live without. The wagons themselves are worth understanding in physical detail, because understanding them means understanding the built-in limitations that emigrants carried before they ever left Missouri. The standard emigrant wagon of the 1840s wasn't the romantic, sweeping prairie schooner of Hollywood mythology. No graceful white canvas billowing in golden hour light. It was a purpose-built freight vehicle, typically 12 to 14 feet long, with wide wooden wheels designed for the flat, hard-packed roads of Illinois and Ohio. The wheel rims were iron-shod, heavy, and built for predictable terrain. When the wagon was loaded, with 5 months of food, farm tools, seed for the new land, spare axles, furniture no one could bear to leave behind, and the 100 small objects that make a house feel lived in rather than merely occupied. It weighed between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds. The canvas cover was treated with linseed oil to resist rain, but it wasn't truly waterproof. In a river crossing, water came over the wagon bed. On a mountain switchback, the canvas pressed against cliff rock and tore. On a downgrade, the wagon's own mass worked against everything trying to control it. These vehicles were designed for flat ground. The trail was not flat ground. The animals pulling these loads were almost always oxen, chosen over horses and mules for their endurance, their relative affordability, and their ability to graze on the native grasses growing along the Platte River Valley. A yoke of oxen in 1846 cost about $60, roughly 2 months' wages for a skilled labourer, and the average family needed 2 to 4 yoke to keep a loaded wagon moving. Oxen were patient and powerful, capable of covering 10 to 15 miles a day in decent conditions, but they were fragile in ways that weren't immediately visible. Heat, altitude, and sustained effort wore them down steadily and quietly. By the time most wagon trains pushed into what is now Wyoming, the oxen had lost a significant portion of their body weight, ribs beginning to press through hide that had been full and tight back in Missouri. By the time the mountains came into view to the west, some animals were barely walking, and the emigrants were asking these failing creatures to haul thousands of pounds of furniture and provisions over passes at 10,000 feet above sea level. The daily rhythm on the trail was relentlessly physical and strangely monotonous at the same time. The camp captain's bugle, or sometimes just the sound of collective coughing, which became its own kind of morning alarm as respiratory illness moved through the wagon train like a slow, quiet tide, woke everyone before 4 in the morning, cold breakfast, or a quick fire if there was enough dry fuel nearby. Yoke the oxen, break camp, be moving by 7, then walk. Walk through the flat morning heat and the hammering afternoon blaze and into the evening cool that came as a mercy when it came. The wagons were too heavily loaded for riders, so most emigrants walked the entire 2,000-mile distance. Women in heavy wool skirts, men in leather boots built for a farmyard, not 1,000 miles of prairie and canyon. Children who started the trip running ahead of the wagons with the energy of people on an adventure, and ended it shuffling in silence, with the look of people who've understood something they can't ununderstand. By noon in July on the Nebraska prairie, the temperature could hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity rising off the Platte River bottomland made it feel worse. There was no shade except what the wagon canvas offered, and the canvas soaked up heat and pushed it downward onto everything inside. Water was available along the Platte for the first several hundred miles, but its quality was unreliable, warm, flat, alkaline, and thick with the sediment of a river that was notoriously more sand than water. Emigrants who drank from it without boiling it sometimes contracted cholera within days. Cholera moved through a person with a speed that left almost no room to help them. A man walking beside his wagon at sunrise could be dead and in the ground before sunset, his belongings quietly divided among the living before the dust on his grave had settled. The sound of the trail shifted depending on where you were. On the Nebraska plain, it was the grinding of wagon wheels in dry ruts, the complaints of cattle, the distant hammering of prairie dogs, the occasional low rumble of a buffalo herd somewhere beyond the horizon. Past Fort Laramie in Wyoming, the sound changed. The land dried and hardened and rose gradually, and the wind picked up a cutting edge it hadn't had on the flats. Something with elevation in it. Something that felt like it had travelled a long way across altitude before it reached you. The trail began to climb, not sharply at first, but persistently, in the way that mountains announce themselves to a traveller before the peaks are even visible. Through the way the ground refuses to stay level, through the way the animals lean harder into their yokes, through the way the wagon tongue strains at angles it never did back on the prairie. Nights on the trail were unlike any darkness most Eastern-born emigrants had known before. The plains night was absolute. No gas lamps, no neighbours' windows glowing a quarter-mile across a field, no distant city warming the horizon with accumulated light. Just stars, in numbers that people from Ohio and Illinois and New York hadn't seen since childhood, if they'd ever seen them at all. So dense in the core of the Milky Way that the sky seemed to have physical weight, as if you could press your hand against it and feel something solid there. The fires burned low by midnight, and people gathered close to what was left of them. Children fell asleep against their parents' sides. Someone played a fiddle or a mouth organ, and the music moved through the dark like a message sent to no one in particular, and received by everyone within earshot at once. But the nights grew colder as August faded into September, and the wagon train pushed further west. Past South Pass, the wide, wind-swept saddle in the Rockies, marking the continental divide at more than 7,000 feet. The mornings came sharp, frost in August, September mornings with ice sitting in the water buckets, shorter days that meant fewer hours of travel before the animals needed rest, and the fires needed building, and the children needed sleep. The emigrants felt the seasonal math in their bodies before they could put numbers to it. In the stiffening of joints in the cold, in the changed quality of the late afternoon light, in the way the grass at the trail's edge was turning gold at the tips, the way grass does when summer's been used up and something else is quietly moving in. What's remarkable is that most of these families were running a continuous mental calculation with stakes they couldn't fully afford to face: food versus miles remaining, animals lost versus loads still to carry. Today's date versus the closing window of the mountain passes ahead. They carried almanacs and trail guides and the occasional letter from someone who had made the crossing in a previous year. Those letters were the most honest information they had. The guidebooks were something considerably more complicated than honest. This was the world Virginia Reed moved through at 12 years old. A world of grinding physical labour, low-grade daily uncertainty, and moments of unexpected beauty so precise and so startling that they lodged permanently in the memories of the people who lived them. The way the Sweetwater River looked in late afternoon, running clear over smooth grey stones in Wyoming. The strange hollow silence of the salt flats west of the Great Salt Lake. A silence different from any other, carrying the quality of a place where something once existed and no longer does. The first sight of the Sierra Nevada from the Nevada desert. A blue-grey wall rising at the far western edge of everything. Permanent and unreachable and terrible and beautiful all at once. She would reach those mountains. What she found in them would stay with her for every one of her remaining 87 years. But before the mountains, before the snow, before the decisions no child should ever have had to watch adults make, there was a story the emigrants had been told about this trip, a story that was, in its most important particulars, false, and that story is where the real danger had always been hiding. The story most Americans grow up knowing about the overland wagon trails goes something like this. Brave, determined pioneers, driven by vision and a frontier spirit that felt uniquely, essentially American, loaded their wagons and crossed the continent through hardship and sacrifice. The trail was hard, yes. People died, yes. But those who made it were heroes, self-reliant, capable, tough in ways that defined not just their own character, but the character of the nation they were helping to build. Their crossing was living proof of something gloriously American, the belief that the right attitude could conquer any obstacle. That story isn't entirely false, but it's missing so much that what remains is closer to mythology than to history. And the gap between the myth and what actually killed people on the Overland Trail isn't a small one, easily filled in with a few extra facts. It's a structural gap, a difference between two fundamentally incompatible stories about why people died and who bore the responsibility. The myth says nature killed them. The historical record says something more complicated and considerably more uncomfortable. Most people believe that the emigrants who perished were undone by the raw, indifferent power of the natural world, by mountains and weather and disease, forces no human preparation could fully prevent. The truth, documented carefully by generations of trail historians, is more specific and more unsettling. The overwhelming majority of trail deaths were preventable. Not all of them. Cholera appeared suddenly, early snowstorms were genuinely unpredictable, and the terrain held real dangers that required skill and experience to navigate safely. But the pattern of trail mortality, who died, when and where, points not to inevitable natural catastrophe. It points to something more specifically human: the systematic failure of information, the economic pressures that distorted that information, and a particular cultural tendency to treat confidence as an adequate substitute for actual preparation. Here's the most important thing the popular narrative gets wrong. The emigrants who died were not working in an information vacuum. By 1846, when the Donna Reed Party set out from independence, the Oregon Trail had been in active use for 5 years. Hundreds of families had already completed the crossing. Their accumulated experience, what worked, what killed people, what mattered most in terms of timing and equipment and route, was in circulation. Men and women who had personally walked every mile of that trail were available to be questioned at the departure points. Letters from successful crossings were being passed hand to hand in the communities considering going west. The knowledge that could have saved the Donner Party existed. It existed in the memories of people who had survived. It was simply and systematically given far less weight than the promotional material being produced by men who had financial reasons to encourage emigration, and no obligation to be honest about the cost. Lansford Hastings published his Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California in 1845. It described, among other things, a route south of the established trail through the Wasatch Mountains and across the salt desert west of the Great Salt Lake. He presented it as shorter, faster, and clearly superior to the proven northern path. He had crossed this terrain once, on horseback, in spring, without wagons, without cattle, without families, without the weight of a mountain winter closing in from the west. He wrote about it in language that made it sound perfectly manageable, because on foot in the right season it was manageable. For a 2,000-pound wagon pulled by weakened oxen in late summer, it was a trap. The Wasatch section of that route required emigrants to hack through dense scrub oak and willow thickets in a narrow canyon that had no natural road. They had to build one with axes as they went. They had to lower and raise wagons by rope over grades that couldn't be driven, and on the other side waited 80 miles of salt desert, terrain that destroyed so many of the Donna Reed Party's cattle that the group arrived at the Nevada portion of the trail with a fraction of the animals they needed. They spent 21 days crossing what Hastings' guide implied could be managed in perhaps a week. 36 miles in 3 weeks, fewer than 2 miles a day, less than half the pace of a slow walk. In those lost weeks, the window through the Sierra Nevada was quietly closing, but Hastings' guide wasn't an anomaly. It was representative of an entire genre, trail literature of the 1840s, that consistently favoured encouragement over accuracy. The commercial reasoning was transparent. More emigrants moving west meant more customers for the outfitters, supply merchants, and fort operators who financed and distributed these publications. A guide that honestly described the mortality rates, the equipment failures, and the precise demands of a 6-month overland crossing would have discouraged people from going. So accurate guides were either never written or never widely circulated, or quietly dismissed when they contradicted the more optimistic alternatives. The market selected for optimism, and optimism killed people. What's remarkable is how clearly the trail record shows the opposite of what the mythology celebrates. The people who survived in the highest proportions were not the boldest or the most confident. They were the most careful. Trail historians have repeatedly identified the same cluster of survival factors across multiple seasons and wagon trains. Early departure, before mid-April, to ensure passage through the Sierra Nevada before October, snow-sealed the passes. Conservative wagon loading, below the maximum animals could technically pull, not at it. Culling livestock before the situation became desperate, not after. Strict adherence to established routes rather than experimental shortcuts. Carrying more food than the most optimistic estimate of the trip's length suggested was necessary. And treating the condition of animals and people as real information requiring a real response, not as inconveniences to be pushed through in service of forward momentum. Caution, not daring, was the primary survival variable on the overland trail, and yet caution is not what the mythology celebrates. There's a third myth worth addressing directly, and it's one that surviving emigrants sometimes spread because it was easier to carry than the truth. The idea that the crossing was primarily a test of individual will and character, and that those who didn't survive had simply failed that test. This was not true. It was psychologically useful for survivors, and it was deeply unfair to the dead. The people who died on the trail were not morally weaker or physically inferior to those who made it. In many cases, they were working from worse information, departing later in the season, carrying more weight, and following advice that seemed credible at the time, and turned out to be catastrophically wrong. A family that bought Hastings' guidebook in St. Louis in 1845 and left Independence in late June of 1846 wasn't making a series of character failures. They were making rational decisions based on the best information available to them, in an information environment that had been commercially shaped to mislead them. Virginia Reed's family had resources most emigrants didn't. Her stepfather, James Reed, was prosperous enough to commission a specially built wagon, a double-decked vehicle with a cast-iron stove, a second-story sleeping compartment with spring cushions, and space for the family's elderly grandmother to travel in relative comfort. It was almost certainly the most luxurious conveyance on the trail that season. It was also almost certainly the heaviest. When the Hastings route proved as brutal as the mountain men had warned, and the remaining animals began dying in the Nevada desert, that wagon became a liability beyond reckoning, too heavy to move with the oxen they had left, too large to navigate terrain that hadn't been built for any wagon, let alone that one. The Reeds abandoned it on the salt flats. They left behind most of what they'd carried from Illinois, and they were, by the time rescuers reached them in the Sierra Nevada in February of 1847, among the more fortunate members of their group. The myth of the Pioneer Trail is, finally, a story about self-reliance defeating nature through the force of American character. The historical reality is something else entirely. It's a story about what happens when an economic system filters information in the interest of profit. When promotional culture substitutes encouragement for accuracy. When ordinary people with children and savings and hopes as real and legitimate as anyone else's, are pointed toward a mountain range on the basis of incomplete and commercially shaped guidance. The mountains didn't kill those people in any simple sense. The gap between what they were told and what was actually true put them on that mountain. The mountain finished what the information failure had started. Virginia Elizabeth Reed was 12 years old in the spring of 1846, and she was not, by any account that survives, an ordinary child. She was the kind of girl who paid attention to everything, the mood of the sky in the hour before a storm, the way adults' voices dropped to register when they thought the children had moved far enough away not to hear, the specific colour of a river in late afternoon when the light came across it at an angle. She held on to these observations the way some people hold on to coins, not sure which ones would matter yet, but unwilling to let any of them go. She was born in 1833 in Illinois, the eldest child of James Stanton and Elizabeth Keyes. Her father died when she was young. She was too small to hold a clear memory of him, and her mother eventually remarried a man named James Fraser Reed. Reed was a cabinet maker turned furniture dealer who had come to America from Ireland as a boy and built himself a comfortable, well-respected life in Springfield over the decades that followed. Virginia called him father without hesitation. She meant it. The Reed household on Fifth Street was warm and well-appointed, full of the particular energy that comes from a family doing well and knowing it, but not yet tested by the question of whether what they'd built could hold up under real pressure. James Reed had been following the accounts of the westward migration with the focused attention of a man who's already half decided something and is still reading to confirm rather than to weigh. He'd studied Lansford Hastings' guidebook. He'd read John C. Fremont's expedition reports. Fremont, the government-sponsored explorer whose writing made the western landscape sound like a dream you'd be foolish not to chase. He'd spoken with returning emigrants and filtered what they said through the lens of what he wanted to hear. By 1845, he was convinced. California meant land and health and a different order of opportunity. The kind a man of his ambition could genuinely build on, if he was willing to move early and boldly enough. He began making plans. Virginia understood something was changing before anyone told her directly. She had the quiet perceptiveness of a child who has learned that the important things are announced in body language long before they're spoken out loud. She noticed her father spending evenings bent over maps spread across the parlour table, his finger tracing routes that ran off the right edge of the paper into territory marked simply as unexplored. She noticed her mother Margaret moving through the pantry shelves with an expression that was neither worry nor excitement exactly, but something in between that Virginia didn't yet have a word for. She noticed the neighbour men coming for dinner and staying long after the dishes were cleared, their voices dropping lower around the fire when the conversation turned to distances, timing, and the specific challenges of the Sierra Nevada passes, all of them talking as though they understood the mountains, none of them having ever seen them. When James Reed finally sat the family down and told them they were going to California, Virginia's first real thought, she said so herself, decades later, in the 1891 magazine account she wrote of the ordeal, was about her horse. She had a pony named Billy, a small grey she'd been riding since she was old enough to hold reins, who knew her by smell and turned toward her when she came into the barn. She needed to know if Billy was coming. He was. That settled the emotional arithmetic for her more completely than any adult explanation could have. If Billy was coming, the whole thing was probably survivable. The family left Springfield on April 14th, 1846. They were a considerable party even on their own. James and Margaret Reed, Virginia and her 3 younger siblings, Patty, James Jr., and Thomas, the youngest barely 4 years old. There was also Virginia's grandmother, Sarah Keyes, 73 and managing a fragile case of tuberculosis she'd been living with for years. 2 hired teamsters, 2 maids, and more domestic animals than most wagon trains carried. And then there was the wagon James Reed had specially commissioned, a double-decker that became something of a legend on the trail. The lower level held supplies and storage. The upper level was a proper living compartment with spring-cushioned seats that folded into beds, windows cut into the canvas cover, and a small cast-iron stove for cold mornings. It was a marvel of overland engineering. It was also a burden of such size and weight that it would eventually become the thing that most limited the family's options when the trail turned against them. They joined a larger wagon train at Independence, linking up with a group that included 2 brothers from the Springfield area. George Donner, 62, was a farmer of substantial means and quiet, steady temperament. His brother Jacob, 65, was a similar kind of man, settled, established, cautious by nature. The Donner families together, George, his wife Tamsin, and their 5 children, Jacob, his wife, Elizabeth, and their 5 were comfortable people making the kind of move that required not desperation, but a specific kind of ambitious optimism. The belief that what was already good could be made significantly better. The combined wagon train that set out on the California Trail that spring numbered nearly 90 people. They had enough provisions for the crossing they believed they were taking. They had no idea they were taking a different one. Virginia's grandmother, Sarah Keyes, died in Kansas in late May near the Big Blue River. She'd been failing for months before the family ever left Springfield. Everyone knew it, but she'd refused to stay behind. She didn't want to die in a house in Illinois while her family was heading to California. She wanted to go as far as she could go, and she went further than anyone expected, travelling more than a month on the trail before the illness finished what it had been quietly finishing for years. She died peacefully in the back of the palace car in the bed made for her with the spring cushions and the blankets from home. The group buried her under a large oak at the edge of the prairie and marked the grave with a wooden headboard. Emigrants travelling behind the Donna Reed party would pass that grave and read her name for years. Virginia helped prepare her grandmother's body for burial. She was 12 years old. The trail in those early weeks was, despite everything, genuinely beautiful, in ways the emigrants hadn't expected from reading about it. The Nebraska prairie in June was a wide, slow-moving ocean of blue stem and switchgrass, the land appearing almost liquid from a distance when the wind moved across it. The Platte River, wide, shallow, sandy, and nearly useless for drinking without boiling, was lined with cottonwoods that provided the only shade for hundreds of miles and made the camps along its banks feel like brief, welcome shelters from the heat. At Chimney Rock, a sandstone tower rising 300 feet from the Nebraska flatlands, the wagon train paused and let people climb as high as they dared, carving their names into the soft stone. Virginia climbed as far as her skirts would allow. She carved her name. She was doing what emigrants had been doing since the trail's first season, leaving a mark, claiming a small piece of the landscape, quietly insisting on the fact that she had been there. By Fort Laramie, Wyoming, the mood in the wagon train had shifted in ways that were hard to name but impossible to miss. The grass was thinner. The water was worse. The oxen were visibly lighter, ribs beginning to press through their hides in a way that read like a slow countdown. Conversations among the adults had grown shorter, more direct, less willing to sit with open-ended uncertainty. At the fort, a letter arrived that Lansford Hastings had sent ahead for any emigrant parties he could reach, urging them warmly and confidently to take his new cut-off south of the established route. A mountain man named James Kleiman, coming east from California, met the group there and told them plainly not to do it. The train wasn't passable by wagons the way Hastings claimed, he said. Anyone who tried it would lose more time than they saved. James Reed thanked him and set aside what he'd said. The group voted. They took the shortcut. In the Wasatch Canyon where Hastings' route led them, the trail the guidebook described simply didn't exist in any form a wagon could follow without weeks of hard manual work to create it. The canyon walls pressed in close on both sides. The oak brush was shoulder high and grew in dense, interlocking thickets that had to be cleared axe stroke by axe stroke. The men worked from before dawn until long after dark, hands blistering and then bleeding inside their gloves. The women drove cattle through the openings the men cut, managed the children, and kept fires burning through nights that were already genuinely cold at that elevation in mid-July. Virginia watched all of it. She didn't complain. She helped where she could and paid close attention to everything else, quietly cataloguing what she saw the way she'd been doing her whole life, not yet knowing which observations would matter and which wouldn't. She would find out. While the Donna Reed Party was swinging axes in the bottom of Emigrant Canyon in the summer of 1846, hacking through vegetation that wouldn't have been there if the guidebook had been honest about the terrain. There were people watching from the ridgelines above who understood exactly what was happening. People who possessed the specific, tested, accumulated knowledge that could have prevented every death that followed. The emigrants didn't know this. It wouldn't have occurred to most of them to ask. The Shoshone had lived in the Great Basin and the surrounding mountain ranges for thousands of years before any European ever mapped the region. The Western Shoshone in particular, whose territory covered the very ground the Donna Reed Party was now struggling through, had spent those millennia developing an understanding of the landscape that was as precise, as practically grounded, and as genuinely useful as any geographical knowledge that existed anywhere in the world at that moment. They knew which water sources ran reliably in late summer and which ones dried out completely by August. They knew the exact elevations where the first October snows fell and held, versus the lower ground where they melted within days. They knew which canyon grades could support the movement of heavy loads and which ones couldn't, not in theory, but specifically from the lived experience of moving people and goods through these same passages across dozens of generations. They knew the Wasatch Mountains the way people know places where they were born, where they raised their children, where they buried their dead, and where they returned every year for 1,000 years running. They also knew the Sierra Nevada. They knew that the passes above what would eventually become Donna Lake could receive 8 to 12 feet of snow in a severe October storm. They knew that severe October storms weren't rare in strong La Niña years, and 1846 to 1847 was a La Niña year, though no one in the emigrant camp had the framework to recognize that, or the local familiarity to read it in the patterns of the wind and sky. A Washoe elder, the Washoe people had long occupied the eastern Sierra, could have looked at the cloud formations above the Sierra crest in late October of 1846 and known with reasonable confidence what kind of winter was coming. The emigrants looked at those same clouds and saw what they needed to see, that there might still be time. This knowledge, refined across 10,000 years, carried forward in language and practice, and the careful instruction of children by their elders, was the single most accurate and most complete source of information available about the terrain these families were crossing. It wasn't theoretical, it was operational. It was precisely the kind of knowledge that could have told the Donna Reed Party things about the Wasatch that Lansford Hastings didn't know and couldn't have known. Because Hastings had seen that terrain once, briefly, without the burden of loaded wagons or dying cattle or a closing season, and then written about it with a confidence that was in inverse proportion to the depth of his actual understanding. Almost none of this indigenous knowledge was sought by the emigrants. Almost none of it found its way into the trail literature that guided them west. In isolated cases, wagon trains hired Shoshone or Paiute guides who led them through difficult stretches of terrain and meaningfully improved their odds of survival. Several groups benefited significantly from exactly that kind of guidance. But the prevailing attitude of the emigrant culture toward indigenous geographical knowledge was a combination of indifference and practical dismissal, not always hostility, but a deep, settled failure to recognize that the people who had lived in this landscape for millennia might understand it better than any published guide written by someone who had passed through it once. The trail literature that most emigrants relied upon made almost no reference to native knowledge of the terrain. This wasn't simply an oversight. It reflected a structural assumption embedded in the emigrant culture, that valid geographic knowledge came in a particular form, written down, measured, produced by people trained in the same tradition as the readers. The Shoshone understanding of these mountains was real, tested, and extraordinarily detailed. It simply didn't arrive in that form, and so it was invisible to the people who needed it most. The relationship between overland emigrants and the indigenous peoples along the trail corridor resists the simplified versions that both the 19th century and the 20th century tried to impose on it, though in opposite directions. The popular imagery of the emigrant era painted native peoples as a generalized danger. The hostile warrior of dime novels and popular illustration attacking wagon trains unprovoked on the open plains. That image was false in almost every particular. The plains and mountain peoples in the early years of the migration were frequently curious, cautious, and sometimes genuinely useful to the wagon trains moving through their territory. The Sioux along the Platte River traded goods and shared information. The Shoshone in Wyoming occasionally guided groups through difficult sections. The actual texture of day-to-day contact between emigrants and native people across the length of the trail was characterized far more by ambivalent coexistence than by conflict, at least in the first decade of heavy migration. But there's an equally distorted version that overcorrects for the dime novel picture by presenting indigenous peoples as simply passive observers of the emigrant tide, rather than as nations with their own political awareness, their own clear-eyed assessments, and their own entirely rational reasons to be growing more concerned about what those wagon trains meant for the land they depended on. By the mid-1840s, the Sioux and Cheyenne along the Platte had seen enough emigrant traffic to understand what was happening. The grass along the trail corridor was being consumed by emigrant cattle at a rate native wildlife couldn't sustain. Water sources were being contaminated. Buffalo herds were being disrupted in ways that didn't recover between seasons. They were watching the early stages of an ecological catastrophe unfold in real time, with no political, legal, or military mechanism that could stop it. From the ridgeline above Emigrant Canyon in the summer of 1846, a Shoshone person watching the Donna Reed Party work below would have been able to make very specific observations. They would have recognized from the date, the condition of the animals, and the pace of progress that this group was dangerously behind the schedule required to clear the Sierra Nevada passes before the first serious snowfall. They would have known the approximate window during which those passes became impassable in a normal year, and they would have known, from whatever the season was already showing them, that this wasn't going to be a normal year. They may also have known a route through the Wasatch that avoided the worst of the canyon entirely, a route used for centuries, walked by generations, and never recorded in any emigrant guidebook because no one writing those guides had thought to ask. What strikes me most is the precision of what was lost in that silence. Not vague, general knowledge, but specific, operational guidance that could have changed the outcome entirely. This is the perspective shift that quietly rewrites the entire story. The mountains were not the unknown. The Sierra Nevada, the Wasatch, the Great Basin, these weren't uncharted, mysterious territories. They were among the most thoroughly understood landscapes on the continent. The people who died in the snow above Donna Lake in the winter of 1846 to 1847 didn't die because the West was unknowable. They died because the knowledge that existed about the West was held by people whose understanding the emigrant culture had been conditioned by education, by commercial pressure, and by the specific arrogances of mid-19th century American expansion to overlook. The expertise was present. The institutional structures to access it simply didn't exist, because building those structures would have required acknowledging a form of knowledge and a class of knowers that the ideology of manifest destiny had no room for. Virginia Reed, lying awake in the cold darkness of a Sierra Nevada November, was in some sense the product of that failure as much as she was a victim of weather and a bad route choice. The mountain hadn't surprised the people who knew it. It had surprised the people who'd been told they didn't need to know anyone who did. That distinction between the surprised and the knowing says something specific about who was given the information and who was kept from it and why. It runs much deeper than one winter's snowfall. The smell reaches you before the view does. A dry, mineral bitterness. the quiet ghost of an inland sea that dried up 10,000 years ago and left its chemistry pressed into a flat white crust stretching out to every horizon. To someone driving Interstate 80 today, the Bonneville Salt Flats are starkly beautiful, almost lunar, the kind of place where land speed records are broken and the ground looks like it was swept clean by something ancient. But to the Donna Reed party in late August of 1846, it wasn't beautiful at all. Their cattle were already bone thin from 3 weeks of brutal canyon work. Their food was running low, and they were more than a month behind schedule. To them, those 80 miles of open salt were a test, with absolutely no room for error. Hastings had told them the crossing would take 2 days. It took 6. The wagons broke through the salt crust, which looked firm from above but hid a soft, wet, brine mud underneath, something that grabbed at wheels and wore the oxen down within hours. The daytime heat on the flats in late August was relentless. The surface threw the sun back upward with an intensity that bleached everything it touched: fabric, hide, skin, and patience. Then at night the temperature dropped close to freezing. That swing between scorching days and bitter nights created a physical disorientation that piled on top of the exhaustion people were already carrying. And there was no water on the flats. They'd brought what they could. It wasn't enough for 6 days. The cattle started dying on the second day, not all at once. That might have been easier, in a strange way. A single blow to absorb, a single moment to grieve. Instead, they went 1 or 2 at a time, collapsing in their harnesses as the salt pulled moisture from their bodies, and the distance from the last water source compounded everything the Wasatch Weeks had already taken from them. By the time the party reached the far side of the salt desert and found water at the Pilot Peak Springs, a significant portion of their livestock was gone. Some oxen had panicked during a night crossing and run off into the dark, never to be found. Others had simply stopped and refused to get back up. The Reed family lost nearly all of their remaining oxen. Their massive wagon, the heaviest in the train, demanded more animal power than anything else out there. From that point on, they'd be borrowing from other families to keep moving, and that kind of debt, between people already stretched to their limit, doesn't stay quiet for long. The wagon train was fracturing, not in one dramatic break, not yet, but slowly, in the small ways that prolonged pressure always finds between people. The arguments over sharing resources got louder. Disputes about pace and priority had an edge to them that hadn't been there back in Nebraska. These were people who had started out as neighbors, as friends, as traveling companions. Now they were becoming something that needed a different word entirely. The math was working against all of them. Food running out faster than the miles were closing, and the weight of that arithmetic pressing down on everyone every single day. James Reed sat at the center of much of that tension. He'd been the loudest voice in favor of the Hastings route. He'd built the heaviest wagon. His family had needed more help than anyone else crossing the salt. And Reed wasn't a man who carried indebtedness or criticism lightly. He was confident, sharp, and used to being right, which made being wrong harder for him than it might have been for someone with a softer relationship to uncertainty. The others noticed. They noticed in the way people notice things after 4 months in close quarters, when the social ease wears away and you start seeing what's actually underneath. The moment that changed everything happened on October 5th, 1846, near the Humboldt River in what's now northeastern Nevada. The train was crawling. Their remaining cattle were struggling. Their pace had dropped to less than 10 miles a day, and the calendar was saying things nobody wanted to hear. A young teamster named John Snyder, who drove for the Graves family, got into a fight at a river crossing with one of the Reed family's drivers. It escalated the way arguments do between exhausted people who've been under sustained pressure for months, fast, with a momentum nobody could stop. Snyder raised his whip. It came down across the forehead of Margaret Reed, Virginia's mother. James Reed drew a knife. Within minutes, John Snyder was dead. That same evening, out in the Nevada desert, the group held a trial. It was part democratic deliberation, part raw impossibility. They were trying to apply order to something that had no clean answer. Reed was found guilty. What came next revealed the full range of what exhaustion, fear, and months of accumulated grievance does to people's sense of right and wrong. Some wanted him hanged on the spot by the rules of the trail. Others argue for mercy, for context, for the fact that Snyder had struck first. In the end, they exiled him. They took his weapons. They took his share of the group's supplies. They put him on a horse and told him to ride ahead to California and send back help. His wife, his 4 children, left behind in the wagon train. Virginia watched her father disappear into the Nevada dusk and didn't know if she'd ever see him again. She was 13 years old. The Sierra Nevada was still more than 400 miles away. The group moved through Nevada in October with the focused urgency of people who understood their situation clearly and had decided to outrun it. They were close to a month behind where they needed to be. Every adult in that party knew it. The mountain passes above the Truckee River. The last real barrier between them and California's Central Valley had to be crossed before the first heavy snow sealed them for the season. The window was narrow in a good year, and 1846 wasn't going to be a good year. Nobody knew that with certainty, but they could feel it. In the cold of the mornings, in the shortened afternoons, in the way the animal's breath was coming out in visible clouds at night. They reached the base of the Sierra Nevada on October the 31st, 1846. 6.5 months on the trail. They were thin. Their cattle were skeletal. Their food was critically low. And the weather at nearly 6,000 feet was already behaving like the front edge of winter. Snow had fallen on the pass above Truckee Lake, partially melted, then fallen again. The trail upward was still visible, just barely beneath a white cover. The group decided to camp for 2 days, let the animals rest before making the final push. It was the last decision they'd make as a group that still believed it had some control over what came next. On November 2nd, the storm arrived. Not the slow, creeping deepening of cold they'd been managing for weeks. A true Sierra Nevada storm. The kind that slides off the Pacific and drops 5 or 6 feet of heavy wet snow in 2 days across the upper elevations of the range. They tried to push through the pass on the first day. They turned back when the snow was chest high on the lead oxen. They camped, certain it would pass quickly. It didn't pass. It deepened. Within a week, Truckee Pass was buried under 10 to 15 feet of snow. Not difficult to cross, not just dangerous, gone. The group was trapped at 6,000 feet, in one of the snowiest mountain ranges on the continent, with food that had been running short for weeks, and no way out in any direction. The Washoe people who lived near that range said the severity of it was beyond anything in their living memory. Virginia Reed, in the cabin at the lake's edge, understood the arithmetic of what was happening. She'd been paying close attention for a long time. She didn't fall apart. She started thinking about what to do next. It was November. The first rescue party wouldn't reach them until February. And the winter of 1846 to 1847 in the Sierra Nevada, before it was finished, would push human endurance to its absolute edge. The Donner Party's story has most often been told as nature versus human will, the mountain as the force working against them, the emigrants as the ones fighting to hold on. And the whole thing moving slowly and inevitably toward the question of who had enough left inside them to survive. That framing isn't entirely wrong, but it covers up something important about how this disaster actually came together. The mountain was the final instrument. What brought those families to the mountain was something else entirely, something economic, something that had been quietly running for years before a single wagon wheel turned on the trail. Westward migration in the 1840s wasn't a purely spontaneous movement, driven by restless individuals and open roads. It was, in large part, a constructed phenomenon, stimulated, shaped and pushed forward by economic interests that profited from moving people and goods across the continent, and that had every practical reason to keep encouraging emigration, even when the honest facts about the trip should have given any reasonable person serious pause. The people promoting westward travel understood something that we'd recognise clearly today. If you tell people how hard something actually is, fewer of them will try it. And if fewer people try it, there's less money to be made. The financial beneficiaries of the overland migration formed a network of overlapping interests, each one reinforcing the others. At the departure end, outfitters and independents in St. Joseph and other Missouri towns sold wagons, oxen, mules, flour, bacon, dried beans, salt pork, and every piece of equipment a family needed for the road, at prices well above what the same goods would have cost anywhere else. Every family that decided to go west was a paying customer. Every family that stayed home was revenue that never showed up. The outfitters had a direct stake in the trail's popularity, and several of the most prominent ones were involved in publishing and circulating the very promotional materials that encouraged people to leave. Further along the trail, supply forts sat at carefully chosen positions where emigrants who'd run low on provisions, which was most of them by the time they reached Wyoming, had no real choice but to pay whatever price was posted. Fort Laramie, Fort Bridger, Fort Hall. These weren't just waypoints. They were commercial operations, and their continued success depended entirely on a steady stream of travellers passing through. A slower trail with more honest information reducing the number of people who set out would have cut into that stream proportionally. Lansford Hastings occupied a specific place in this system, and it went well beyond simple enthusiasm. He had a documented personal agenda in California. He wanted to establish himself as a political leader of what he hoped would become an independent California republic, and he understood that ambition required a large population of American settlers already on the ground. His guidebook wasn't purely commercial, it was also political, designed to funnel emigrants toward California specifically, and to route them through territory where Hastings had connections and interests. The Fort Bridger operation, run by Louis Vasquez and Jim Bridger, sat right at the junction of the established trail and the cut-off Hastings was promoting. Wagon trains that stayed on the established route bypassed Fort Bridger completely. Wagon trains that took the Hastings cut-off stopped there to restock. Vasquez and Bridger stood to gain financially from every family that Hastings' letter persuaded to take the southern route. The conflict of interest was total, and it was never disclosed. The people producing the information that shaped emigrants' most consequential decisions had financial stakes in the choices they were steering people toward. No institution existed to check whether any of it was accurate. No legal obligation required them to reveal their interests. No regulatory body made sure the trail guides bore any resemblance to the actual ground they described. Hastings wasn't required to have travelled by wagon the route he was recommending for wagon travel. He wasn't required to disclose that his associates had commercial interests along the path he was pushing. He wasn't required to acknowledge that experienced mountain men who'd actually covered that terrain disagreed with his conclusions. He simply wrote what he needed to write, published it, sent letters ahead to intercept wagon trains on the road, and waited at Fort Bridger for them to arrive. The government's role in all of this was one of absence rather than active wrongdoing. But it was a meaningful absence. The United States had conducted extensive surveys of Western geography through its corps of topographical engineers. Explorers like Fremont had published widely read reports, but those surveys were built around strategic and cartographic concerns, mapping the physical features of the continent, charting river systems, sketching the broad shape of the land. Not around the practical questions that determined whether people lived or died. How much food does a family of 5 need to carry for 6 months on the trail, accounting for spoilage and the extra demands of sustained physical labour at altitude? How many days does a wagon team in average condition need to cross the Wasatch Mountains by the proposed southern route? What's the latest safe date to begin the Sierra Nevada crossing before the passes seal for the season? Those were the questions the commercial guidebooks claimed to answer, and frequently got wrong. The government surveys had the resources and the mandate to address them accurately. They were pointed somewhere else. The political atmosphere of the 1840s made honest trail reporting not just commercially inconvenient, but politically uncomfortable. The Polk administration's expansionist agenda, the annexation of Texas, the Oregon settlement, the Mexican-American War that was already building on the horizon as the Donna Reed Party loaded wagons in Illinois, required a particular story about the West, accessible, manageable, rightfully American. The doctrine of manifest destiny, laid out by journalist John L. O'Sullivan in 1845, gave that story its ideological spine. The United States was divinely ordained to spread across the North American continent. The expansion was both inevitable and good. In that framework, an accurate accounting of trail deaths wasn't just unwelcome information, it was subversive. You couldn't argue that westward expansion was providential, ordained by God, and also quietly acknowledged that the trail to that promised land was claiming 1 life for every 85 yards of ground. What resulted was a deep, sustained shortage of accurate information reaching the very people who needed it most, not maintained by any conspiracy, just by the ordinary workings of a commercial and political system that rewarded movement and quietly penalized anything that slowed it down. The promoters weren't villains, most of them. Many genuinely believed what they were saying. Hastings probably convinced himself his route was workable in some version of the terrain that lived in his imagination and his selective recollection. The outfitters charging high prices were simply running businesses in a seller's market. The political leaders rapping the West in the language of destiny didn't think of themselves as sending anyone to their deaths. They thought of themselves as pointing the nation toward its future. Virginia Reed didn't know any of this. Sitting in the Breen cabin at the edge of a frozen Sierra Nevada lake in November of 1846, she had no way of knowing about Hastings' political calculations, or the commercial arrangement at Fort Bridger, or the expansionist math being worked out in Washington. What she knew was simpler and heavier. They were out of food. The snow wasn't stopping. The man who'd been the loudest voice for the route that put them here had ridden away into the Nevada desert 4 weeks ago. Her little brother had stopped asking for food in the middle of the day, not because he wasn't hungry, because he'd learned that asking didn't change what was there. The adults were having conversations just outside the cabin door that went quiet whenever a child came close. She knew enough. And what she knew, without having the words for it yet, was this. The system that had placed them on that mountain had never been designed with their survival as its first concern. The first thing you notice about Donna Lake in a Sierra Nevada winter is the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty room or a peaceful country road. Something heavier than that. A deep, dense, almost physical silence. The kind that settles over a landscape buried under 8 or 10 feet of snow. The trees don't creak. The wind doesn't move through the underbrush, because there is no underbrush. It's all buried. The wind travels somewhere above the snowpack, overhead, distant. What reaches ground level isn't sound. It's a kind of surrounding whiteness that extends in every direction and turns familiar things, the shoreline, the boulders, the tree stumps, into shapeless obstacles the eye can barely read. Inside the rough log shelters where the stranded party had taken cover at Truckee Lake, that silence wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. Virginia's family was living, existing, more accurately, in a one-room cabin belonging to the Breen family. Patrick Breen was a steady, deeply religious Irish immigrant who had kept a journal throughout the entire trek and continued writing in it through the worst of that winter. His entries were spare, factual, restrained in a way that made them somehow more devastating than anything dramatic could have been. Patrick and Peggy Breen had 7 children, ranging from a teenager down to a toddler, and the cabin was already crowded before the Reeds moved in. After they arrived, it became crowded in a different way. The kind of crowded that happens when people are being generous beyond what they can actually sustain, and everyone in the room feels it, and nobody says it out loud because saying it out loud would mean admitting that the situation might not be temporary. Margaret Reed was among the most capable people in that stranded camp, and she brought every bit of that capability to bear, not loudly, not dramatically, but without stopping. When the food ran out, she boiled ox hides that had been set aside for moccasin making. She cooked them for hours until what remained in the pot could be called broth, only by the most charitable definition. She organised the children to dig through the snow around the cabin, searching for pine cones, pulling out the tiny seeds inside and treating them as something worth eating. The task took hours. It produced barely a handful of calories, but it gave the children something purposeful to do, and it gave Margaret something to add to the pot. She divided whatever food remained into portions so small she had to keep herself from looking at them too long, and she told the younger children in a voice so steady it walked the edge of a lie that rescue was on its way. She said it so often, and with such quiet conviction, that the little ones believed her. That was probably the most important thing she did. Virginia helped with all of it. 13 years old, and she worked with the practical steadiness of someone who'd been paying close attention her whole life. She seemed to understand, without being able to put it into words, that competence was the only form of comfort that was actually useful here. She cut firewood when the men were too worn down to venture far from the cabin. She kept the fire going through the nights when the temperature dropped well below 0, and letting it fade wasn't an option. She kept her younger siblings calm and occupied the way older children do, through play when that was possible, through distraction when it wasn't, through the quiet projection of a normalcy that everyone knew was fragile, but that everyone needed to hold on to. Her small dog stayed pressed close to her through all of it. She'd brought a terrier from Springfield. She mentioned it later in her writings, briefly and without sentiment, just noting it was there and what it did. Through those Sierra winter nights, the animal slept against her legs in the cold, providing a warmth that was modest in any measurable sense, and meaningful in every way that counted. She wrote that it helped her sleep on the worst nights. That detail doesn't need anything added to it. The group's food supply ran down along a timeline that felt, to those living through it, both agonizingly slow and terrifyingly quick at the same time. The oxen that had died back in November, their bodies held intact in the snow like a grim, accidental pantry, provided meat through the first weeks. But there weren't enough of them. By mid-December, the carcasses were almost entirely gone. The remaining hides were consumed. People started eating leather, belts, straps, the tanned covers of books. Children gnawed on bones that had already been boiled twice over. The adults began saving certain conversations for after the children had fallen asleep. Though no one could ever be entirely sure whether the children were truly sleeping or simply lying still, listening. The Forlorn Hope set out on December 16th. 15 of the strongest remaining members of the party, 8 men, 5 women, and 2 teenage boys, carrying 6 days' worth of food and wearing snowshoes they'd built themselves from oxbow wood and strips of rawhide. Their plan was to cross the Sierra Nevada on foot, reach California, and organize a rescue party to come back for everyone left at the lake. That meant crossing a mountain range in December on handmade footwear with barely enough food for less than a week and no shelter except what they could piece together each night from what the snow offered. It was the plan that comes when the only alternative is staying put and fading away. 8 of the 15 made it across. 7 died in the mountains from starvation, exposure, and weeks of demanding more from their bodies than bodies are built to give. The ones who survived ate the flesh of those who hadn't. They reached the California settlements in early January and carried word of the families still trapped at the lake. The first rescue party that took shape in California wasn't a government effort. It was built from volunteers. Some were emigrants from earlier seasons who knew the Sierra in winter and what it asked of a person. Others were moved by the news of the stranded families and felt they couldn't stay still. Some were motivated by compassion, and some by the awareness that in California's small, still-forming communities, the kind of person you were in a crisis tended to be remembered. James Reed, banished from the wagon train back in October, by then living in California, was among the most driven organizers of that effort. He worked through his guilt and his fear by moving fast. It was probably the most useful thing either of those feelings could have produced. The first rescue party left Sutter's Fort in early February 1847. 7 men, as much food as they could carry at altitude. They crossed the Sierra Nevada in the opposite direction from the Forlorn Hope, uphill in February on snowshoes, through passes that turned brutally cold at night and required slow, careful navigation by day. They reached Truckee Lake on February 19th. Several members of the rescue party later described what they found in terms that made even seasoned mountain men go quiet for a moment before they started to work. The camp was not what they'd expected. It was worse in some ways, and in others, in the fact that people were still there, still alive. It was more than they dared to hope. Virginia Reed was standing in the doorway of the Breen cabin when she spotted the rescue party crossing the snow-covered meadow in the distance. She wrote about that moment later with a restraint that carries more weight than any dramatic telling could have managed. They were thin men, coming toward them through the white. She knew what they were before she could make out their faces. She ran. Her mother Margaret, too spent to run, leaned against the cabin wall and made a sound that Virginia never described. Because some sounds don't have words, Virginia crossed that meadow in the snow, frostbitten and weak at 13 years old, running toward those men with everything she had left. It turned out she'd been quietly holding something in reserve for exactly this. She was evacuated with the first rescue group. Her siblings followed in the second wave, her mother as well. Her father James was moving with the second rescue party, heading into the mountains at the same time Virginia and the first survivors were coming out. They met somewhere on the trail, a Sierra Nevada slope in late February, snow still 12 feet deep in places around them. Virginia saw him coming toward her on that mountainside. The account she left of that moment is 4 words. She ran to him. The mountain had demanded everything. It hadn't quite gotten all of it. In the fall of 2021, a family driving through the Nevada desert followed their GPS navigation app down a closed, unmaintained dirt road deep in the Basin and Range country southeast of Reno. The app said it was a viable route. The app was wrong. Within a few miles of the highway, the road dissolved into dry lake bed. Their SUV sank axle deep into alkaline mud the color of chalk. They were stranded in temperatures that swung from over 100 degrees in the afternoon to the low 30s before dawn, in a spot that had no reason for any other vehicle to pass, with cell service that flickered briefly into range and then vanished before a single call could connect. They spent several days out there before search and rescue tracked them down. They survived, dehydrated and badly shaken, because they had water bottles in the car and because help found them before those ran out. The GPS told them to go that way, so they went. The device spoke with the authority of a system that had been right thousands of times before, in parking lots, on highway ramps, in cities the family had never visited. They trusted it over their own eyes, over the road closure signs posted at the junction, over what the landscape itself was plainly showing them. This isn't a story about technology breaking down in any narrow technical sense. The app didn't malfunction. It simply had incomplete information about a road that no longer existed the way its database expected, and it delivered that incomplete information with the same calm, confident, turn-by-turn voice it uses when it's completely right. The confidence was real. The knowledge behind it was not. The same structural dynamic that put that Nevada family in danger is the one that put the Donna Reed party in danger, nearly 2 centuries apart, and its persistence across that stretch of American life points to something important, a human tendency that no amount of new technology has removed. It's simply taken new shape. Americans have long been unusually willing to trust an authoritative source over what their own senses are showing them. In 1846, that authority came from a published guidebook written by a man with interests he never disclosed. In 2021, it came from a phone application built on an incomplete database. Both spoke with confidence. In both cases, that confidence was not proportional to the accuracy, and in both cases people followed the confident source into terrain that was nothing like what they'd been told to expect. This particular failure, confidence outpacing actual knowledge, isn't a historical curiosity from a time before decent maps. It has clear, specific modern expressions that affect millions of people in ways their 19th century counterparts would recognize, even if the technologies themselves would be unrecognizable. Look at the real estate market of the 2010s. Algorithmic valuation tools transformed how Americans made the largest financial decisions of their lives. Those platforms generated precise-looking dollar figures with a single click, numbers with decimal places, with the visual design language of data you could trust, trained on millions of transactions. What they didn't include was the flood history of the basement, the proximity to industrial infrastructure that didn't show up on the satellite image, the school district boundary running 3 blocks in the wrong direction, the soil subsidence problem no algorithm had measured. People bought homes based on those numbers. Some of those decisions worked out fine. The ones that didn't were typically the ones where the gap between the algorithm's confident valuation and the property's actual condition was widest, which is precisely the same gap that separated Hastings' confident description of the Wasatch Canyon from what the Wasatch Canyon actually was. The supply chain parallel is just as direct, though it plays out on a longer timeline and a larger scale. At its core, the Overland Wagon Trail was a supply chain. People, food, equipment, and animals moving through a physical corridor over a set time frame, dependent at every stage on accurate information and reasonably stable conditions. When the animals gave out, when food ran short, when the route information proved false, when the calendar extended beyond what the provisions could support, those were supply chain failures, and their consequences were immediate, personal, and sometimes fatal. The emigrants at the far end of that chain were its most exposed nodes, and they had the least real-time information about how things were actually holding together. until they were already deep inside a failure cascade with no clean way out. In the spring of 2020, when COVID-19 tore through global supply chains with a speed that stunned the people who had built and managed those systems for decades, the structural echoes of the Overland Trail were specific and traceable. Grocery store shelves went bare, not because food production had stopped, but because distribution systems had been tuned so precisely for normal, predictable conditions that they had no capacity left to absorb anything outside that range. Medical supply shortages emerged not from manufacturing collapse, but because inventory levels had been trimmed down to their leanest possible state in the name of efficiency, leaving no meaningful buffer when demand broke sharply from its historical pattern. The just-in-time logistics model had been celebrated for decades as the pinnacle of supply chain thinking. It turned out to be just in time for the conditions it was designed around. When different conditions arrived, there was nowhere left to go. The Donner Party's supply chain failed for exactly the same structural reason. It had been calibrated for the trip they'd been told they were taking. When the trip turned out to be something else entirely, there were no reserves, no redundancy, and no plan for the situation that was actually unfolding. There's a quieter version of this mirror, and it doesn't require any systems-level thinking to recognize it. The emigrants who died on the Overland Trail were not reckless people. They were ordinary people who made decisions that seemed entirely reasonable, given what they knew, inside an information environment that had been commercially shaped to make those decisions feel well-grounded and sound. The person who read Hastings's guidebook in St. Louis in 1845 and concluded it was reliable wasn't a fool. They were thinking clearly inside a system that had been carefully constructed to produce exactly that conclusion. That's the most unsettling version of this story, because it takes away the comfortable distance between those emigrants and us. They weren't a different kind of person operating under different cognitive limitations. They were a person in a different information environment, and the information environment is the variable that changed, not the fundamental shape of the failure. Virginia Reed's letter to her cousin, "Never take no cut-offs and hurry along as fast as you can," doesn't translate into a simple rule for every modern decision, but the instinct it carries is exactly as relevant today as it was in 1847 when she wrote it from California in her shaky 13-year-old hand. The route presenting itself as shorter than the established proven path usually has costs that don't show up until you're already committed. The person recommending the shortcut deserves a simple question: what do they stand to gain from your taking it? And the information that arrives with the greatest confidence should be examined with the greatest care, not the least, because confidence that outruns knowledge is among the most reliably dangerous things that can be handed to someone facing a decision that actually matters. The Donner Party had that substance in abundance. Someone had been producing it and selling it to them since before they left Missouri. Nobody stopped to ask who was doing the manufacturing, or why. The pharmaceutical information landscape of the 1990s and early 2000s carries the same fingerprints. Direct-to-consumer advertising reshaped the relationship between patients, doctors, and drug information in ways that would have felt structurally familiar to anyone who'd read Hastings's guidebook. Pharmaceutical companies produced marketing materials that described their products with the same kind of selective, confidence-projecting language Hastings used about the Wasatch, technically accurate in the narrowest sense, organized to lead toward a specific conclusion, structured in a way that quietly pushed aside the information that would have led somewhere different. Patients arrived at doctors' offices having absorbed those materials and asked for specific medications by name, having been guided effectively by a source with the same undisclosed financial stake in their choice that Hastings had in the Donner Party's route selection. The regulatory framework governing those materials was more developed than anything that existed in 1846. but the underlying dynamic was recognizable across the century and a half between them. The gap between what's claimed and what's actually true has always been a persistent feature of commercial information. Not a historical anomaly from the trail guide era, something older than that, and something that's still very much with us. Walk into any gathering of serious overland trail historians and put one question on the table. Was the Donner Party disaster a unique catastrophe, the product of specific bad decisions and extraordinary bad luck? Or was it a representative example of the structural dangers built into the overland trail system itself? The room divides along that line every time, and the argument doesn't resolve in an evening, because the question goes to something fundamental about how we assign responsibility when people die following decisions made in good faith on the basis of bad information. If the disaster was unique, an outlier shaped by an unusual combination of poor choices, harsh fortune, and historically severe winter, then the 41 deaths are a cautionary tale about specific people making specific mistakes, not a systemic indictment, not a reflection of the broader information culture surrounding the trail. But if it was representative, if the conditions that produced those deaths were present to varying degrees in every wagon train that attempted that crossing, then the disaster isn't an exception to the story of the Overland Trail. It's a clarification of what that trail actually was. A system with preventable death built into its operating assumptions, producing casualties at a rate the promotional materials refuse to acknowledge, and that the political culture of manifest destiny simply couldn't afford to admit. The historical evidence, accumulated across more than a century of careful scholarship, leans heavily toward the representative interpretation. George Stewart's meticulous 1936 study established that the Donner Party's fate was decided by a margin so thin that departing from independence just 2 weeks earlier, combined with avoiding the Hastings cutoff, would almost certainly have produced a successful and entirely unremarkable crossing. Kristin Johnson, whose decades of archival work represent the most thorough modern account of the disaster, has argued that the persistent focus on individual decision-making as the primary cause has served to shift accountability away from the systemic level and onto the personal one. If the disaster was caused by James Reed's arrogance or Lansford Hastings' recklessness, then the broader structure, the false guidebook information, the commercially motivated fort operators, the absence of accurate government guidance, the political culture that framed hesitation as weakness, gets absolved. The individual character narrative, Johnson suggests, functions as a kind of institutional protection dressed in the language of historical analysis. The counter-argument is serious, though, and it deserves honest engagement rather than quick dismissal. The Donner Party was unusual in one specific, well-documented way: the degree to which its members rejected direct first-hand testimony from someone who had physically just travelled the route they were considering. James Kleiman wasn't a theoretical skeptic of the Hastings cutoff. He was a mountain man with 30 years of experience who had crossed that exact terrain that same season, and who told the group plainly at Fort Laramie that the canyon was not passable by wagons the way the guidebook described. Other wagon trains in the summer of 1846 received the same letter from Hastings. They had access to the same experienced trailmen. They faced the same choice. And they took the established northern route. They cleared the Sierra Nevada in September. The Donner Reed Party's decision to set aside direct, specific, spoken experience in favour of a printed authority wasn't standard emigrant behaviour. It was a particular judgment failure, a preference for the confidence of the written word over the testimony of someone who had actually been there. And it contributed directly to everything that followed. James Reed's individual culpability remains contested in the historical literature because the surviving sources can't settle it cleanly. He was the loudest advocate for the Hastings route within the group. He drove the heaviest wagon, His family required the most help from others during the Salt Desert crossing, building up debts of obligation that quietly gathered resentment among people already under enormous strain. He was involved in the killing of John Snyder, which removed his leadership at the worst possible moment, and yet Reed was also among the most driven organizers of the California rescue effort, entering the Sierra Nevada in February at personal risk to take part in the second rescue wave. His later written accounts of the Fort Laramie decision distributed responsibility broadly across the group, without acknowledging the full weight of his own advocacy. Virginia Reed's published account of the ordeal was carefully measured on the subject of her father's role, careful in a way that reads, from the outside, as a combination of honest historical reflection and the quiet loyalty of a daughter who loved him. The exact proportion between those two things isn't available to anyone reading a century and a half later. Reed was neither villain nor hero, which is probably the most accurate description available, and also the least satisfying one for a story that people want to remember clearly. Men who bore significant responsibility for a catastrophe and then worked hard to address its consequences occupy a moral position that doesn't fit neatly into the categories that make stories last. The simpler versions, the reckless schemer, the selfless rescuer, are easier to carry, which is probably why Reed's name has faded from the popular telling of the disaster, while the Donner name stayed attached to it. Even though the Donner brothers played a relatively passive role in the critical route decisions. Running alongside the main historical debate is the ongoing controversy over how to discuss the 4 documented instances of cannibalism among the stranded party. Serious historians who have examined the Donner Party across the past century have fairly consistently argued that the emphasis on cannibalism in the popular narrative has transformed a story fundamentally about information failure, commercial exploitation, and systemic vulnerability into a gothic horror story about individual depravity. It displaces accountability from the structural to the sensational. Whether extreme starvation produces extreme survival behavior is not a question of morality. It's a question of physiology, of what the human body does when it reaches its absolute limit. What happened in the Sierra Nevada in the winter of 1846 to 1847 was not a moral failure. It was a supply chain failure, carried all the way to its final end. And the people stranded at the far end of that failure did what humans have always done when the alternative is not doing it, and dying. The debate ultimately circles a question of moral architecture that reaches well beyond the trail. In a tragedy produced by the interaction of individual choices and systemic conditions, what is the right distribution of responsibility? That question hasn't been settled in the historiography of the Donner Party. It hasn't been settled in American law or American culture either. When people die following bad information provided by sources with undisclosed financial stakes in the choices they're steering people toward, who bears the cost? In 1846, the answer was simple: the people who died, and no one else. The people who produced the false information paid no legal price. In most cases, they suffered no meaningful reputational consequence. The legal and commercial framework governing trail information was never reformed in the wake of the disaster. That framework's structural descendants are still operating today. And that's the fact the debate about the Donner Party keeps arriving at, no matter which direction it approaches from. There's one more question the trail record can't cleanly answer, but that haunts every serious examination of the disaster. What would have happened if the group had voted differently at Fort Laramie? If the voices urging the established northern route had prevailed, and by some accounts they came close, the Donner-Reed party would almost certainly have cleared the Sierra Nevada in September without incident. They would have become one of hundreds of successful wagon trains that crossed that year. They would have left no trace in the cultural memory that anyone carries today. the 41 people who died would have lived. Their children and grandchildren would have been born. The specific moral universe of the disaster, the choices made under extremity, the remarkable rescues, all of it, none of it would have existed. History doesn't sit comfortably with counterfactuals, but the Donner Party's nearness to an entirely different outcome is part of what makes it stay with people the way it does. The margin was so thin. The information that could have saved them was sitting right there at Fort Laramie, in the person of James Kleiman, available for the price of listening. The choice to dismiss it wasn't inevitable. It was made by specific people in a specific moment, inside an information environment that had been carefully shaped to make exactly that choice feel reasonable. The debate about the Donner Party is, at its deepest level, a debate about whether we can see that kind of environment clearly enough to make a different choice when it shows up again. And it does show up again, reliably, in different forms, in every generation. The news of the Donner Party disaster reached California newspaper readers in the spring of 1847 in fragments. Each report was worse than the one before it. First came word that the forlorn hope had survived, the 15 who'd set out on foot in December, 8 of whom eventually made it through. Then the rescue of the lake camp survivors in February and March. Then a partial, contested, and in places significantly inaccurate accounting of who had died and how, which moved through the California settlements by letter and newspaper reprint, and was national news by summer. The story was consumed with enormous appetite, partially understood, and then stored in cultural memory primarily through its most extreme elements, while the most instructive parts, the most accountable parts, faded fastest. The most immediate concrete consequence of the disaster was a practical correction in how trails were being recommended. The Hastings Cutoff was, for all meaningful purposes, abandoned as a viable wagon route after 1846. The connection between that southern path and the catastrophe was strong enough and public enough that most experienced trail advisors steered emigrant groups back toward the established northern line through Fort Hall. That was a genuine safety improvement. It came at the cost of 41 lives, and it was never accompanied by any legal proceeding, formal inquiry, or public accounting of the commercial interest that had produced and distributed the false information in the first place. Lansford Hastings wrote no correction. His publisher issued no retraction. Nobody was held accountable in any formal sense for any part of the informational failure that led to the disaster. The lesson was absorbed at the practical level. The accountability question was never asked. The broader information infrastructure of the trail improved gradually through the late 1840s and 1850s. Partly this was driven by the sheer scale of the California gold rush migration that followed. Partly it came from a recognition, never formally stated as policy but functionally present, that the existing guide literature wasn't adequate for keeping emigrants alive. The Army Corps of Topographical Engineers conducted more systematic surveys of the mountain passes and desert crossings in the years after 1847, producing maps and route descriptions that were more accurate and more practically useful than anything the commercial guidebook market had offered. That trajectory eventually led to the creation of the United States Geological Survey, the institution whose topographic maps became the gold standard of American geographic information for more than a century, until GPS made them feel incorrectly and dangerously obsolete. The California Gold Rush of 1848 and 1849 transformed the Overland Trail more fundamentally than any policy change could have. An estimated 90,000 people made the crossing in 1849 alone, compared to the few thousand who had attempted it in any year before the gold rush. That volume of traffic created demand for services along the route, and the market met it with the characteristic American speed for responding to clearly demonstrated need. Ferry services appeared at the most dangerous river crossings. Way stations with provisions and rough shelter established themselves at critical sections of the trail. The mountain crossing above Truckee Lake developed supporting infrastructure because the traffic volume finally made that infrastructure commercially worthwhile. None of this was planned or directed by any government body or safety authority. It grew from the economic logic of serving a large and essentially captive group of customers. It also, almost incidentally, made the trail significantly less likely to kill the people using it. That's a description of how a great deal of American infrastructure has actually been built, not through forethought and deliberate public planning, but through accumulated commercial response to demonstrated need after enough people had already suffered for that need to become financially attractive to address. The consequences for the indigenous peoples of the trail corridor were catastrophic in ways that no subsequent policy could undo. The national narrative of the Overland Trail era has consistently and substantially underplayed this. The Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Shoshone, the Paiute, the Washoe, and many other nations experienced the emigrant migration not as a distant disruption, but as the progressive physical destruction of the ecological systems they had depended on for thousands of years. The grasses along the Platte River corridor, the ecological foundation of the buffalo-dependent economies of the Plains nations, were consumed by emigrant livestock at a rate that the native wildlife couldn't survive alongside. By the early 1850s, a belt of ecological damage stretched along the trail corridor from Missouri to Wyoming wherever the road ran with any density. Water sources were contaminated, wildlife populations were disrupted and gradually driven off. The military violence that completed the dispossession came later, in the 1860s and 1870s, but its foundation had been laid by 20 years of emigrant traffic that had steadily degraded the resource base of the Plains nations and established a demographic and economic pressure on their territories that no military resistance could ultimately have turned back. California's admission to the Union as a free state in 1850, driven directly by the gold rush population surge the trail had delivered, shifted the balance between free and slave states in ways that fed into the political crises of the 1850s and ultimately into the Civil War. The Overland Trail didn't cause the Civil War, but the population it deposited in California changed the Senate arithmetic that shaped when and how the sectional conflict became a constitutional breaking point. The trail altered the political map of the nation, not through any intention on the part of the emigrants, through the quiet accumulated weight of their movement. The legal architecture governing trail information, or more precisely the complete absence of any such architecture, had consequences that extended far past the emigrant era. In modified and updated form, they're still operating today. Lansford Hastings was never legally accountable for the deaths that resulted from following his guidebook. American publishing operated in the 19th century without any meaningful obligation of accuracy on geographical or navigational claims, and the legal protections the industry developed over the following century were extended, with modifications, to digital information providers, including the navigation app companies whose products route drivers down closed roads and into flooded intersections with the same confident, authoritative voice that Hastings put on the page in 1845. The legal framework that allowed Hastings to retire to Brazil without consequence is the structural ancestor of the frameworks protecting the companies whose information products guide the 49ers of the digital age. Interstate 80, which carries some of the heaviest freight traffic in North America, follows the emigrant trail route through Utah, Nevada, and over the Sierra Nevada so closely that in places the highway passes directly over or immediately beside the original wagon ruts. The Central Pacific Railroad, the western half of the first transcontinental line, completed in 1869, was surveyed through the Sierra Nevada along the same passes the emigrants had identified as viable crossings. The specific gap in the ridgeline above Donner Lake, the pass where 41 people died because it closed 4 weeks before they could reach it, became and remains the nation's primary overland transportation corridor. The bodies of the people who identified that corridor, in the most brutal possible way, are built into the foundation of the road that runs through it. The freight moves at speed now. The road beneath it does not move at all. There's a final long-term consequence that sits beneath all the others, and it's the hardest to see clearly, precisely because it's been so thoroughly absorbed into the fabric of everyday American life. The Overland Trail established not just the physical routes that became the railroads and the highways, it established a cultural expectation that the West is a place you move through efficiently, at speed, on your way to somewhere else. The trail produced a fundamentally transactional relationship to the Western landscape. The land as obstacle, as corridor, as the resource to be extracted or crossed, rather than lived in and understood. That's the opposite of the relationship the Shoshone and the Paiute and the Washoe had developed and maintained across thousands of years. The trail didn't just cross their territories, it installed a way of seeing and relating to the land that is still, in its basic structure, the dominant way most Americans move through the western United States. We drive through it, we fly over it, we extract from it, we manage it with instruments and models. We rarely stop long enough or quietly enough to hear what it might be trying to tell us, which is more or less what Lansford Hastings failed to do in the spring of 1845 when he crossed the Wasatch on horseback and decided he understood it well enough to write a guide. Virginia Reed arrived in California in March of 1847 as someone the Sierra Nevada winter had fundamentally remade. Though the full shape of that remaking would take years to become visible, even to her. She was thin, not dangerously so since she'd been evacuated in the first rescue wave before the worst of the starvation had run its course. 2 of her toes were frostbitten, and she was carrying something that doesn't show up on any scale. The accumulated specific weight of everything she had witnessed in those months above the snow line. But she was also, unmistakably still herself, the sharp observational quality that had defined her since early childhood was intact, maybe more precisely calibrated than before. The particular kind of steadiness she'd shown through the Wasatch Canyon, across the salt desert, and through those long months in the Sierra cabin, the ability to do the next useful thing without being swallowed by the enormity of what surrounded her, had been tested to its absolute limit and confirmed. The Reed family settled in San Jose. James Reed rebuilt a version of his Springfield life with the focused energy of a man who has a debt to settle. In his case, that debt was both literal, he'd borrowed animals and provisions from people who might not have made it out, and something more complicated and more private. He prospered. He became a figure of civic standing in California's rapidly forming society. He served briefly in the Mexican-American War, which was still ongoing when he arrived. He lived until 1874, a respected San Jose citizen who occasionally gave interviews about the trail years. In those interviews, he tended to distribute responsibility for the Hastings cut-off decision broadly and evenly across the group. That was partially accurate, and partially the kind of careful reshaping that people apply to the stories that are hardest to carry in their original form. Margaret Reed lived until 1879. In the Sierra Nevada, she'd been one of the most resourceful people in the stranded camp. Steady, inventive, determined not to let her fear pass itself along to the children in her care. California life suited her in ways the record makes visible even at this distance. She'd survived the thing that was supposed to break her. It hadn't broken her. It had clarified something she'd always carried, something that ordinary circumstances hadn't had reason to test at that depth, or with that kind of completeness. Virginia married at 17 to a man named John Murphy from New Mexico. They had 9 children. She built a full California life across the following decades. Children, grandchildren, the slow and steady accumulation of an ordinary long existence in a place still in the process of becoming what it would be. When journalists and historians arrived with questions about the Donner Party, she received them with the calm of someone who has had decades to decide what she thinks and has thought it through carefully. She answered their questions precisely. She gave them what she judged they needed to know, and she withheld what she judged they would misrepresent. Her 1891 account in Century magazine, Across the Plains in the Donner Party, is one of the most valuable primary documents the disaster produced and one of the most carefully constructed pieces of personal historical writing from 19th century America. She was 57 when she wrote it, looking back across 44 years at events that were still specifically present in her memory, the way formative experiences from early adolescence tend to remain present, not as stories you tell yourself, but as scenes that exist in permanent, effortless reach. On the cannibalism, she was brief and direct. Extreme circumstances produce extreme responses, and the dignity of the people involved was not diminished by the extremity of what they faced. On her father's role in the route decision, she was careful in a way that reads as a combination of honest, historical judgment and the loyalty of a daughter who loved him deeply. The proportion of each isn't determinable by anyone reading from the outside. The Breen family, all 9 of them, Patrick and Peggy and their 7 children, survived intact. Patrick Breen's journal of the ordeal, kept through the worst of that winter in a handwriting that stayed steady even as the entries recorded the deaths of neighbours, is one of the most restrained and emotionally devastating documents the disaster left behind. He recorded deaths and snowfall measurements and daily prayers with equal brevity, as though the discipline of careful observation and the discipline of faith were both expressions of the same underlying survival practice. The Breens prospered in California, settling in San Juan Bautista, becoming landowners and respected community figures. Patrick Breen died in 1868. His descendants are still in California. The transformation of America in the wake of the Overland Trail era was enormous, structurally permanent, and morally complicated in ways the nation began acknowledging formally only very slowly and very partially. The way Americans told the story of the trail shifted over time in ways that track the nation's changing relationship to its own foundational myths. In the 1850s and 1860s, the survivors who wrote about it did so with the specificity of people still close enough to remember which river crossing was hardest and which stretch of trail had the worst water. The mythology came later, built by people who hadn't been there, for people who would never go. By the 1880s and 1890s, the covered wagon had become a founding national symbol. Frederick Jackson Turner's 1893 frontier thesis, the enormously influential academic argument that the Western frontier had forged a distinctly American character, formalized that mythology into doctrine. The 40,000 graves along the trail corridor didn't appear in the thesis. The nations whose lands had been crossed and whose ways of life had been destroyed didn't appear in it either. They didn't fit the story being assembled, and a story that doesn't fit gets quietly left out. Virginia Reed Murphy lived to 1921, 87 years old at her death, the same number as the people trapped above Donner Lake in that first week of November 1846. She had outlasted nearly everyone from that winter. She had told her story carefully, honestly, and on her own terms. She had built the life that crossing was supposed to deliver her to, and she'd built it with the particular care of someone who understood what things cost, because she had been present when the cost was collected. She carried her advice to the end. No cut-offs. Pay close attention to what the landscape is actually telling you. not what the map says it should be. Move as fast as you can because the calendar doesn't negotiate and the window is real. But never let anyone's confidence in a shorter path substitute for your own eyes on the ground in front of you. The transformation of the survivors extended beyond the psychological into something more practical and more lasting. The people who came out of the Sierra Nevada in the winter of 1847, the ones who'd spent 3 months in those mountains, were changed in one specific way that their later lives reflected. They were extremely difficult to frighten, not because they'd become reckless or indifferent to risk, but because they had a calibrated reference point for what genuine mortal danger actually felt like. And against that reference point, most of the things that unsettled ordinary people in ordinary life registered as manageable. Several survivors went on to distinguished records in the harder aspects of California frontier life, mining in dangerous conditions, ranching through drought years, crossing other mountain ranges in other seasons. The experience hadn't made them fearless in the hollow, careless sense of that word. It had made them accurately fearless, capable of distinguishing between the situations that genuinely warranted their full attention and the ones that didn't, in a way that people without that reference point often couldn't. Virginia demonstrated this quality throughout her adult life in ways the historical record makes visible even now. She wasn't easily unsettled by the ordinary difficulties that unsettled ordinary people. She wasn't easily impressed by confident claims about situations she hadn't personally assessed. She maintained, through all the years of her long California life, the quiet habit of looking at what was actually in front of her, rather than what she'd been told was there. That isn't a minor biographical detail. It's the living proof of a specific kind of knowledge that the Sierra Nevada winter had produced in her. Knowledge that couldn't have come any other way, and that she carried forward and put to use for 74 years after the rescue party crossed the meadow. There's a specific kind of failure that's nearly invisible from the inside, because it doesn't feel like failure when it's happening. It feels like being well informed. It feels like having done the research, consulted the right sources, arrived at a reasonable conclusion based on the evidence available. You have a guidebook, you have a route, you have a plan. The plan is built on information from people who are positioned to know. It was presented with authority and confidence. Other reasonable people in comparable situations have accepted it. From inside the moment of deciding, it feels like the right choice made by a careful person on solid ground. The failure only becomes visible later, sometimes much later, sometimes at the foot of a mountain in October, when the snow is falling and the passes are closing and the cattle are dying. By then, visibility isn't the most useful thing anymore. The Donna Reed Party didn't fail because its members were unintelligent or careless by the standards of their time. Several of them were sharp, practical, experienced people who had built successful lives through consistently sound judgment in the areas where they genuinely knew what they were doing. They failed because the information environment they were operating in had been commercially shaped to produce a specific conclusion. The trail is manageable, the shortcut is viable, the window is sufficient, and that commercially shaped information was indistinguishable from the inside, from information that was simply true. They couldn't see the difference between knowledge and commercially motivated encouragement, because no one had given them a way to make that distinction, and because making it would have required questioning sources of authority that their culture had trained them to trust without examination. The practical lesson this story offers isn't a general instruction to be suspicious of everything. Comprehensive skepticism is its own kind of failure. It makes action impossible, decisions arbitrary, and every source of guidance equally unreliable, which is a worse condition than the problem it's trying to solve. The lesson is more targeted than that, and more useful. Information that comes from sources with a financial or personal stake in your decision requires a specific, named, conscious examination. What is that stake? And how might it be shaping what the source chose to tell you? And, just as importantly, what it chose to leave out. Hastings wasn't lying in the simple, deliberate sense of that word. He believed a version of what he wrote, but he was describing terrain he'd crossed under conditions fundamentally different from those he was recommending it for. In a document that advanced his political ambitions and the commercial interests of his associates, without disclosing any of that context to the people reading it, the emigrants had no framework to recognize this. Nobody had taught them that the foundational question about any information source isn't just whether the information seems plausible, but what the source gains from the choice it's steering you toward. The emigrants who survived the overland trail in the highest proportions, across all seasons, across all the wagon trains the historical record covers, consistently demonstrated a cluster of habits that the evidence allows us to identify with some confidence. They left on time, not because early departure was virtuous in the abstract, but because they'd done the arithmetic on travel time against the seasonal window without letting optimism shade the numbers. And they treated the result as a hard constraint, not a flexible suggestion. They gave heavy weight to the testimony of people who had physically travelled the terrain they were about to enter, over the claims of publications written by people who hadn't. They monitored the condition of their animals and their food supply as real, live information that required real-time response, not as inconvenient obstacles to a plan that could be explained away in the interest of keeping up momentum. And when the evidence accumulated that the plan wasn't producing the expected results, they were willing to revise it. Even when revision felt like failure, even when everything around them was encoding revision as weakness. That last habit was probably the hardest one to hold on to, because the cultural moment the emigrants were operating in made changing course feel genuinely dangerous, in ways that went well beyond personal embarrassment. Turning back, slowing down, acknowledging openly that the route wasn't working. These were coded in emigrant culture as failures of will, and that coding was itself a contributor to mortality. The pressure to keep going was continuous and enormous. It came from the guidebook, from the social dynamics of the wagon train, from the whole cultural apparatus of manifest destiny that framed forward motion as virtue and hesitation as weakness, and from the deep human reluctance to be the person who holds everyone else back. The emigrants who survived weren't people who felt none of that pressure. They felt it, they took it seriously, and they responded to the evidence in front of them anyway. Virginia Reed's letter to her cousin, "Never take no cut-offs and hurry along as fast as you can," compresses the hard-earned wisdom of someone who survived a very specific kind of failure into as few words as possible without losing what matters. It's not advice against ambition or speed. It's advice against the particular combination of ambition and speed that borrows time it doesn't have, through terrain it doesn't know, based on the confidence of someone who won't be there when the bill comes due. The advice is about calibration. Go fast, yes, because the calendar is real and the window doesn't bend, but don't let anyone convince you that the shorter line on the map is faster in the actual world, especially when the person drawing that map has something to gain from your taking it. There's a subtler layer of wisdom in this story that requires thinking about the relationship between individual decisions and the systems those decisions are made inside of. The Donna Reed party made a series of choices that, examined one at a time and in isolation, each had a defensible basis. Taking the Hastings cut-off had a published source, endorsers, and the theoretical advantage of saving distance. Resting at the base of the Sierra Nevada for 2 days had the genuine basis that the animals were worn down and needed recovery before the final climb. Waiting out the November storm had the basis that early-season Sierra storms sometimes pass quickly. Each decision, looked at alone and on its own terms, can be rationalized. What no single decision captures is the cumulative, compounding effect of all of them together on the one variable that couldn't be negotiated with: time against the mountain's calendar. Nobody in the Donna Reed party was continuously doing that calculation and letting it override everything else. Nobody had told them it was the calculation the entire enterprise hinged on. The guidebook had offered a different set of numbers, ones that came out the way they needed, and they had trusted the guidebook over the arithmetic that the terrain and the calendar were quietly, accurately performing for anyone willing to read them. The trail also reveals something specific about collective decision-making under sustained stress. The vote at Fort Laramie that sent the group down the Hastings Cutoff was, formally, a democratic decision made by the assembled members of the wagon train. Informally, it was shaped by the most confident and the most articulate voices in the group, voices that happened to belong to people with particular stakes in the outcome, and by the social dynamics of a community that had been under continuous pressure long enough that the desire for resolution and forward movement had started to outweigh the desire for accuracy. That dynamic appears in institutional decision-making under stress in every era, in every setting. The urgent need to decide and move on, combined with a confident voice recommending a specific course of action, produces outcomes that neither the individual nor the group would have chosen with more time, less pressure, and better information. Understanding this doesn't make it easy to resist, but it makes it possible to recognize, and recognition is the necessary first step. The most durable wisdom the trail offers isn't a rule, it's a practice. The practice of distinguishing between information you've tested and information you've simply inherited, between confidence you've earned and confidence you've been sold. The emigrants who made it through the Sierra Nevada alive were, in many cases, not more knowledgeable or more capable than those who didn't. They were more honest, in the specific sense of being honest with themselves about the difference between what they actually knew and what they only believed. There's a version of the American story that begins at the Atlantic shore and moves west, and in this version, the movement is the meaning. The continent was the opportunity. The crossing was the proof. The mountains were the final trial. And the people who crossed them, or died trying, were doing what Americans have always understood as the essential American act, refusing to be stopped by geography, by distance, by the weight of every obstacle stacked between a person and the life they were reaching for. This is the version that lives in textbooks and political speeches and 100 years of American popular culture. It lives in the particular resonance of "Go West, young man," which is simultaneously a statement about land and a statement about faith. The faith that what lies ahead can be made better than what's been left behind, that the distance between you and it is crossable, and that the willingness to move toward it is itself a kind of virtue. That version isn't false. The crossings happened. The courage was real. The suffering was real. The determination of the women who walked 2,000 miles in heavy wool skirts that absorbed equal parts dust and heat. The men who held wagons on cliff faces by rope and will in driving rain. The children who made it through a Sierra Nevada winter on ox-hide broth, and the unshakable conviction that rescue was on its way. All of it was real. All of it is documented, and all of it deserves to be honoured honestly, without needing to qualify it out of existence. But there's another American story living inside that first one, not replacing it, not cancelling it, but not containable within it either. It's the story of what the National Project required ordinary people to pay, in lives, in years, in health, and how unevenly that cost was distributed among the people involved. It's the story of 40,000 graves along the trail corridor, each one representing someone sent west with inadequate information, by a system organized around the benefits of their movement rather than the safety of their passage. It's the story of the indigenous nations whose homelands the trail cut through, whose knowledge of that landscape was the most accurate knowledge available, and whose expertise was never sought, because seeking it would have required an acknowledgement that the cultural moment simply couldn't accommodate. It's the story of the Chinese and Irish workers who died building the railroad through those same Sierra Nevada passes a generation later, whose names appear only partially in the historical record, and whose graves are largely unlocated and unmarked. Who are we, as a nation, in relation to both of those stories, held at the same time, without letting either one erase the other? That's the question the Overland Trail puts to the American identity, and it can't be answered by picking a side, not by making the pioneers purely heroic, purely victimized, or purely at fault, not by treating the trail as either a clean triumph or an unqualified catastrophe. Both things were true simultaneously about the same events. The courage was real, the informational failure was real. The westward transformation was genuine and consequential. The dispossession was genuine and catastrophic. These aren't competing interpretations between which a reasonable person has to choose. They're coexisting historical realities. And the habit of lifting one to make the other disappear is a form of dishonesty with real costs. The evidence keeps insisting on both, regardless of what any particular cultural moment prefers. The covered wagon is one of the most potent symbols in American visual culture. It appears in political rhetoric, in advertising, in national self-description, in ways that have long since outgrown any literal connection to a wooden vehicle with an oilcloth cover. It means the willingness to move toward what you want even when you can't see it clearly. The willingness to stake the accumulated weight of a life in one place on the possibility of something better somewhere else. It means the specific kind of American optimism that refuses to accept the world's current shape as either permanent or sufficient. That meaning is genuine. It's rooted in something people actually did. But in historical fact, the covered wagon was also frequently overloaded past what the animals pulling it could sustain across a mountain crossing. It was guided by literature written by people with undisclosed financial interests in the route it took. It moved through landscapes that other peoples had inhabited for 10,000 years, people whose knowledge of that ground was far superior to anything the wagon carried, and whose lives were being progressively dismantled by its passage in ways that almost none of the emigrant journals recorded with accuracy or care. The symbol and the object are not the same thing, and the gap between them is a gap in the American self-understanding that has never been fully closed. It may not be closable. The symbol is too powerful, too necessary to a certain kind of national self-telling, but the gap can be acknowledged. Acknowledgement is not nothing. It's the beginning of the kind of honesty that builds things meant to last. Virginia Reed Murphy understood the difference between the symbol and the thing, because she had been inside the thing, a heavy wooden vehicle in a narrow mountain canyon in winter. Not enough food, no way out. She'd lived both the courage the symbol celebrates and the systemic failure the symbol conceals, and she treated them as separate realities because they were. When she wrote about the trail, she wrote about the thing itself. She didn't dress up what she'd survived. She described it. She trusted that the full, specific, unromanticized truth was more useful to the people coming after her than any cleaner, more inspiring version would have been. The Overland Trail emigrants are us, in the most direct and literal historical sense. The people whose decisions and suffering produce the physical and institutional landscape we actually live in. The roads we drive, the states we inhabit, the water systems that carry Sierra Nevada snowmelt to California cities, the legal frameworks that govern the land. All of it has its origins, traceable and specific, in the movement of those wagons. The trail built the West. and the West we have is built on a foundation that included 40,000 graves, the destruction of dozens of indigenous nations, and a persistent, structurally maintained gap between what people were told and what was actually true about the land they were crossing. That's not a foundation we can pretend isn't there. It's just the one we have, and what we build on it from here, whether with the same structural blind spots that produced the original costs, or with something more honest and more lasting, is still being decided. Mostly by people who aren't thinking of it as a decision at all. The immigrant experience on the trail complicates this identity story in ways that rarely get examined directly. A significant share of the emigrants who made that crossing were themselves recent arrivals to the United States. Irish families fleeing the famine, German families escaping the failed revolutions of 1848, Scandinavian families drawn by the availability of agricultural land. The Breen family, whose cabin at the lake became the centre of gravity for the stranded party's survival, was Irish. Patrick Breen had come from County Wexford. He kept his journal through the Sierra Nevada winter in a prose style shaped by decades of Catholic devotion and Irish literary culture. In the story of the American West, he occupied a position that was neither simple nor comfortable. He was simultaneously a victim of a system that had given him false information and a participant in the displacement of the indigenous peoples whose territory the trail crossed. He was, in that way, representative of the actual complexity of the people who made the crossing. People who were often themselves dispossessed or marginalized in the world they'd come from, and who were becoming, through the act of moving west, participants in a dispossession they didn't fully understand they were part of. That complexity isn't a reason to stop making moral judgments. It's a reason to make them with more care and more precision. To ask not just who benefited from the overland migration and who paid for it, but how those benefits and costs were distributed within each of those groups, and what the people at the centre of the story actually understood about their own position in it. Virginia Reed didn't understand what her family's migration meant for the Shoshone and the Paiute. Neither did most of her travelling companions. That's a real limitation of their moral vision. It is also what makes their experience genuinely instructive, rather than merely historical. The pass above Donner Lake, the narrow cut in the Sierra Nevada ridgeline where the trapped emigrants tried and failed to break free in November of 1846, carries Interstate 80 today. Tractor trailers move through it at highway speed, hauling freight between the Bay Area and the interior West. On a clear October day, a driver can look out at the same granite walls and pine forest that Virginia Reed saw at 13 years old. The moment she understood, with a clarity she wouldn't have chosen for herself, that the window she'd needed had already closed. The pass doesn't look dangerous from inside a heated cab at 65 miles an hour. It looks like a corridor, which is exactly what it is. The same corridor it was in 1846, carved by the same geology, subject to the same Sierra Nevada weather systems that still produce the same category of October storm that sealed it, and left 87 people stranded on the wrong side of it. The Donner Pass weather station, operated by Union Pacific Railroad to protect the rail line running through that same cut, records snowfall and wind and visibility in real time every single winter day. In severe years, it logs snowfall events of 5 to 8 feet in 48 hours, the same kind of event that closed the pass in 1846. The winter of 2022 to 2023 recorded over 700 inches of total snowfall at the summit, the most in 70 years. The following winter recorded the third lowest Sierra Nevada snowpack on record. The swing between those two consecutive seasons exceeded anything the planning models for California's water infrastructure had been designed to absorb. Not a trend moving steadily in one direction. Swings in both directions. with greater reach and less predictability at the planning horizons that matter, for the engineering decisions, for the water management systems, for the 25 million people whose faucets depend on what falls in the Sierra Nevada and when it falls and how fast it melts. The Truckee River, which drains Donner Lake and runs east into Nevada, is a water system under pressure from multiple directions at once. It feeds the city of Reno, it feeds agriculture across the Truckee Meadows, and it's supposed to feed Pyramid Lake at the end of its run on the Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribal Reservation. Supposed to, because in dry years it increasingly doesn't reach the lake at all. Pyramid Lake is a terminal lake, one of the most ecologically significant in North America. It's home to the kiwi, a fish species found nowhere else on Earth and regarded as sacred by the Pyramid Lake Paiute, who have lived alongside these waters for thousands of years. The kiwi is listed as endangered. The lake level has been dropping for over a century as upstream water use has steadily reduced what the river delivers. In severe drought years, the Truckee delivers almost nothing, and the people who have lived alongside that water for millennia, who understood its cycles, its limits, and its seasonal behaviour more precisely than any subsequent user has, hold the least legal authority over where it goes. This isn't a metaphor. It's hydrology and property law and a water rights doctrine designed by and for the people who arrived on the Overland Trail, not the people who were already there when the trail arrived. The doctrine of prior appropriation, first in time, first in right, was formalized during the California Gold Rush era and has governed Western water law ever since. The Pyramid Lake Paiute have spent more than a century in courts and negotiations, working to recover a viable share of the water flowing through their ancestral territory. The legal framework governing those negotiations was built by the same cultural moment that produced the Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. By people with financial and political stakes in the outcome, who didn't disclose those stakes, who constructed a system that consistently directed resources toward the newcomers and away from the people who had been there the longest and knew the land the best. The future the trail points toward isn't some generalized sweeping catastrophe. It's something more specific than that, and more negotiable. A recurring confrontation with one particular question. Whose knowledge of the landscape is treated as valid and authoritative when the decisions about that landscape's future are being made? The Shoshone knew the Wasatch, the Paiute knew the Truckee. The Washoe understood the Sierra Nevada snowpack in ways that encoded survival-relevant information across dozens of generations of direct observation and careful transmission. That knowledge wasn't consulted in 1846. It isn't consistently consulted now. The institutions that manage Western water, Western land, and Western transportation infrastructure were built by people trained by their education, their culture, and the specific arrangements of power in the mid-19th century to treat certain forms of knowledge as authoritative and certain other forms as background noise. Some of those arrangements are still in place. Some are being contested unevenly and slowly, with outcomes still undecided, still mattering. Virginia Reed was 13 years old when she came down out of the Sierra Nevada in February of 1847, frostbitten, thin, carrying more than her years could reasonably be expected to hold, having survived the thing that killed 41 of her travelling companions. She lived to 87. She built a full life in the state the crossing was supposed to deliver her to, and she watched that state become something no one standing in the Wasatch Canyon in 1846 could have pictured. Populous, wealthy, politically powerful, threaded with railroads and highways and aqueducts. She watched all of it from near the very beginning, and she never stopped knowing what it had cost to get there. Because she had been among those costs, one of the people who paid with months of her childhood, 2 frostbitten toes, and every specific detail of everything she'd witnessed in that cabin at the lake's edge. Details she carried forward with the precision of someone who understood that they mattered more than the summary. The mountain is still there. The pass is still there. Snow still falls in October in the years when it chooses to, on a schedule that consults nothing human and adjusts for nothing constructed. The corridor through which freight now moves at 65 miles an hour is the same one through which 87 people moved at 2 miles an hour in the fall of 1846, guided by a document that had never been honest with them about what the mountain was or what it required. The difference between then and now isn't that the mountain has become less capable of what it did in 1846. It's that we've built enough infrastructure around the danger that most of us never have to feel it directly. We pass through at speed, insulated from the terrain by layers of engineering that are extraordinary and real, and that will continue to function right up until the conditions they were designed for no longer describe the world they're operating in. When that moment comes, as it came in November of 1846, the mountain will be exactly what it has always been: patient, specific, and entirely indifferent to the gap between what we were told and what is true. There's a detail about Donna Lake that doesn't appear in most popular accounts of the disaster, but that matters for understanding what the place actually is. The lake sits at 5,936 feet above sea level, in a granite bowl carved by glaciers that retreated roughly 10,000 years ago. Roughly the same period during which the Shoshone and the related peoples of the Great Basin were establishing the patterns of seasonal movement and ecological understanding that made them the most accurate authorities on the region's geography. The lake itself is cold enough that water below 30 feet never warms significantly, even in summer. Its clarity in calm weather is remarkable. You can see the bottom in the shallower sections with an almost unreal precision, every rock and plant visible through water the colour of cold sky. In winter, buried under 4 or 5 feet of ice and 6 to 10 feet of snow above that, it becomes invisible, not frozen exactly, absorbed into the larger white landscape, indistinguishable from the meadow around it. The emigrants built their cabins at its edge without fully understanding what they were at the edge of. They were at the edge of a landscape that had been inhabited, named, understood, and navigated successfully for 10,000 years, by people who had learned, through 10,000 years of survival, exactly what the mountain asked of you, what it would forgive, and what it wouldn't. That knowledge was there, in the landscape itself, quietly present, waiting to be read by anyone who'd been taught to read it. Nobody in that wagon train had been taught. Nobody had told them they needed to be. Many wagons never made it past the high passes, where snow came early and the air grew too thin to breathe easily. Some families had to leave behind everything just to keep moving forward. That quiet resilience is what stays with me, and it's what bedtime sleepy is here to remember. Sleep peacefully now.